I'm a really visual person. I'm not joking when I say I'm really grateful I can't see you. Most of my frame of reference is visual. You know, I've been drawing since I was about 6 years old, and I'll talk more about that later. But engaging the visual has been probably the closest thing I've really experienced to religion in my life, despite sometimes wanting more. And I am going to show you pictures today. I do want to make that part of what happens today. But I've also been told not to rely too heavily on them. So I also want to use some words. And I think the first words I'm going to use are from, oh, golly, it's gone. OK, well, here's for winging it. No, there we go. John Keats, Ode on a Grecian Urn. You may have to read this in lit someday, so I'm going to keep this really brief. Beauty is truth, truth, beauty. That's all you know on earth and all you need to know. Which should sum this up nicely, so I can leave now. But it's a really interesting line. A famous poet, T.S. Eliot, who I admire a lot in some ways, once said, I wish he hadn't included it. It spoiled the whole poem. I think it's always hard to break up the flow of something and introduce something so bold. But in some ways, that's what I'm going to talk about today. But first, let's walk it back to Keats. The poem is about him describing an ancient artifact. And he's kind of the way we sometimes do when we see something that has this alien quality of the beautiful. He is sort of just moving over the surface. But then he does something that I think was somewhere on that Karis Merrifield list. He begins to talk to the object, which is interesting. Next time you're in a museum, I actually do this. You know, he sort of talks to the elements inside the object, and he talks to the characters that are depicted on the urn. And it's a gorgeous poem, but it's also kind of long. And so I'm going to just move through. I've picked away everything else except the words he uses to describe beauty, which are kind of mystical here. Beauty for me was an attractive, even important word when I was being trained as a visual person, when I was trying to become an artist. I think one of the interesting things about being a young person is so often you know you're something before you get to be it. And there's this fascinating gap between knowing you're something and actually feeling like you have become that something. It turns out to be much longer experience than you realize. And we'll talk more about that later too. But along the way, there's certain kind of beacons. And for me, as somebody who's ended up in a life, kind of a crazy life, between experiences that are purely visual and having to attach language to them, certain words are those beacons, and one for me was beauty. But it's a hard word to approach. It's an abstraction. So, bride of quietness, foster child of silence and slow time, leaf-fringed legend. Poets. Okay, now, also though, is it a mad pursuit? Is it a struggle to escape? Is it a wild ecstasy? There's one bit at the end. I think doubt is important in the poem. We'll talk also about doubt. But here toward the end, fair youth, beneath the trees thou canst not leave thy song, nor ever can those trees be bare. What does it mean? I think Keats wrote those lines in part for himself. He's actually addressing a little person sitting under a tree playing a song. Part of that person will never leave that song. That urn has captured that moment that's going to live forever. But also Keats is 23, which is younger than it may sound to my teenage audience here. And he has 2 years to live. He's going to be wiped out, like so many others, by the tuberculosis pandemic. And he's a young doctor, and if he doesn't already know, he's months away from knowing. Tuberculosis is a slow death. So, not to bum everybody out, but I think there's a degree to which he is finding a moment of eternity in this beauty that he's hanging on to for dear life in this very, very vulnerable moment. Now, to bring this back to you, to sort of escape from English lit lecturing, what I think we want to think about here, the part of the poem that wasn't for Keats in this emergent moment, but is for you after, for as long as anyone cares about that poem or poetry, is this idea that there is a place you can return to, where there is part of you that is always going to be young, is always going to possess a kind of innocence that is indescribable and precious. And it's great there's nothing here, so I don't have to describe it to you. But I do want to talk about beauty. That's sort of going to be the bubble that all this fits into, and the bubble that you can kind of enter. And you might kind of wonder why you need to hear the talk. It's not as palpable and as urgent as some of the other things we've just been hearing about, and I'm okay with that, because you get a break after this. But I think it's important because we're living in a moment where we're absolutely saturated with images of desire. And there's this terrible thirst for these things we can't. It's not that we can't have them. In fact, we live at a time when it's very easy to acquire objects of desire and glut ourselves with them. But it's that we can't become them. We can't have them restore us the way they seem to promise to. And they are pleasurable, and I love distraction. But I think it's fair to acknowledge, and I'm thrilled that there are old people in the audience who know this, but I'm thrilled that there's young people in the audience who are beginning to apprehend this really meaningfully. There are moments when none of this keeps us sane. There's moments when none of those images of desire are enough. And in moments like that, I want you to consider this idea of beauty and how it might be, to return to my title, actually useful to you. I'm so excited that earlier you've already had to hear about crisis. Crisis is this moment when things are not enough, when what we know, the framework we create around the world, is not right. And our unconscious keeps sending, it's insufficient, it's not right, it's just not enough to handle what we're experiencing. And our unconscious keeps sending us these messages about all the things it needs and all the things it's concerned about, and it just starts to fall apart up here. And Carl Jung, the famous Swiss psychoanalyst, defined this as the crisis, and he talked about, okay, this is the midlife crisis, so, you know, if you're not 35 to 50, don't panic just yet. But here at the bottom, you've got birth, it's you, yay, stoked, exciting, childhood, and you're growing up, and you're developing passion, and you're accomplishing things like, you know, I can crawl now, that's exciting. I understand the Pythagorean theorem, all right. And then, you know, you get to this point. I think it's like around 27 for a lot of us, where you begin to, like, I've got a thing. And it seems to be coming together. And then you're sort of rising up through your 30s, where people actually listen to you. And then, wham, the midlife crisis. And the midlife crisis, according to Jung, is all that potential, and then, you know, like, death. Sooner or later, right, you begin to realize what it might be like. And there's these diminishing possibilities. My SoundCloud rap career is never going to take off. You know, I'm never going to be a famous painter. I'll get trapped at a boarding school. There's all these things that could happen where you're like, okay, I accept it. And hopefully with that acceptance comes, you know, wisdom. Maybe we define what fulfillment is. And that's kind of our curve. Now, younger folks, there's this whole other thing we talk about that really starts, I mean, who knows, maybe it starts in middle school now for all I know, but I think it really hits home around 16. And I think it can drag on for a very long time, well into your mid-20s. And that we call the identity crisis. And it's not unlike this. The identity is born out of childhood. And there's a real beauty in childhood. But the awful struggle is in adolescence, you have to process that beauty because the miracles are gone. And it's such a challenging road, and we never give young people credit for how hard that is to say, yeah, it really happened, and it continues in the world, that beauty I experienced, colored as it was with mercy and love and care and innocence and excitement and all of that. And now you're in this awful teenage wasteland I had a song queued up for that. I'm not going to use it. And, in that moment, you're like, all right, was it all some sort of cosmic joke? And you have this crisis, right? And this happens actually repeatedly through your life. A kind of birth, a kind of death, a kind of birth. I get asked a lot by my students how I grade art. Turns out this is my actual rubric. This is actually, Donald Cuspin, an art critic, said, you can use Jung's model to look at artwork. In fact, middle-aged people, c'est moi, can judge artworks in part because they understand this idea of the birth, the raw feelings, the germs of influence, the sourdough starter of possibilities, moving on up through bad ideas, good bad ideas, ego death, cautious optimism, innovation. Temporary moments of genius. Is this really even happening? And then anxiety. There's one bit that says, Dad says it's okay. That's when the anxiety starts, right? And you move on up, and there is creative death, and it happens. And it's challenging, these moments when you can't find that beauty and you can't find that strength. Now, if you imagine both these things together, to me, this is the young person. You're an art project, and you're also a person in crisis. And I think it's okay to say that. It's okay to acknowledge the crisis. I mean, it's tremendously funny. If you don't think it's funny now, I promise you'll find it funny later. Note the adult laughs there instead of the... But it's true. It's true. Young people are artworks to themselves. It's the strangest situation to be in. It is a little bit absurd, but it's also incredibly moving. And it's a huge privilege, well, no, let's say honor, to be in that space with those of you who are going through that. And yeah, I think, we need to really acknowledge some things about beauty and youth. Beauty is tied up with shame. It's tied up with embarrassment. It's tied up with self-consciousness. I swear 80% of the young people I work with are ashamed of the beauty they radiate accidentally when they roll out of bed in the morning. It's fascinating to watch. A teacher once said, genius is as common as dirt. I see it all the time. I think the hard part, again, is figuring out what to do with it and how to live in it. And I gotta say, older folks out there, and even younger folks who are looking at the world, looking at the culture, we can all be so critical of other people who write a song, or who dance, or who draw, or to do these things. Even poorly, we're so critical of them. But we have to realize, if there's anything in this culture you find beautiful, really moving, it was found by someone young, or young in themselves, or young to the culture they landed in. Anyone radically vulnerable, which is what young people are, certainly. When I was young and radically vulnerable, this was a critical moment in my life. I was 21 years old. I was sitting in a parking garage with a really old book of poetry that I had not been able to crack open, grabbed it at random, found these words almost immediately: shock, transformation. They're from the poet Rilke, who remains a favorite poet of mine, because he opens up questions in the middle of the poem. Beauty's nothing but the beginning of terror. We're still just able to bear, and why we adore it so is because it serenely disdains to destroy us. Every angel is terrifying. What does that even mean? I like its enigmatic qualities. Rilke, when he wrote it, was going through a crisis. He desperately wanted help. He felt no one could understand him. And he said, what about even something divine? It terrifies me. When I think about this now, in a world where maybe we're not necessarily thinking about actual angels, I think we're terrified of that potential in ourselves. It brushes up against madness. It's deeply disconcerting at times. It isolates us. And beauty hovers in this space that we can just touch. And there's so much uncertainty. And I found this when I was very vulnerable. Sure, I was 21. My parents had just passed away, both of them in the last couple of years. I had met someone wonderful, but I didn't really recognize entirely how unalone I was. I had no idea how to live in the real world, and I thought about death constantly. Definitely a time to find a poem. I think I do need to underscore, our fear of not controlling the universe. Starts with our fear of not being understood at all, of being incoherent to ourselves and others. And I think about crises where we really encounter this as a culture. How many of you made art during COVID? Now, by this, I don't necessarily mean you made, a tremendous work of architecture, or you choreographed a dance piece, or you wrote a screenplay. I mean that you maybe made a long, long, long playlist and shared it among people you knew because on some level you thought it summed up this vibe that was happening. Maybe you organized all of these photographs you had and really picked over them, looked through them, and recreated situations socially that were now inaccessible. And would they ever end in that summer of 2020? Gia Tolentino, writer for The New Yorker and author of a wonderful book called Trick Mirror, wrote in an interview in July 2020 that, she said, most of us have more untapped potential, more negative capability than we'll ever recognize. Negative capability is actually a term from, yes, Keats. And it's this idea that you can get comfortable living with the unknown. You get comfortable living with the uncertain. And you can find a way to navigate it in ways that other people are ill-equipped to do because you relent ordinary control, and you can do this other thing. I think of a negative capability all the time. This idea that negative, there's something you just can't see. It's beneath the surface. And yet somehow in that zone, you're going to be capable. You're going to find your way in ways that others maybe can't. I mean, maybe you lose your car keys all the time, like I do, or your keys, and I can't let people into the studio, and it happened twice in the last week. I lost 2 sets of keys. But I also got to act in a film. I worked on a poem. I'm working on a painting that's not terrible. I'm working on a very, very long dad playlist for my daughter. Feels so important. With great serenity and comfort and excitement and keen interest that helps me to escape, move above, or find a sort of ecstasy amid times when I do not have control, which, let me tell you, working at Brentwood is a lot of the time. Working with young people is a lot of the time, right? You just have to accept you don't have control. I think if I wasn't involved with art or with beauty on some level, I kind of think I'd lose my mind. I first discovered negative capability for myself when I was about 6 years old in a hospital. I got sick often. I spent time in hospital, and I drew all day. I was bored. I wasn't this wonderful creative person. I just needed to find a way to be capable and to want the days to pass slowly instead of quickly. This work is, I'm going to show you a few artworks before I close up here. And this work I've always been really inspired by. It reminds me of being in the hospital, but it also reminds me, honestly, of looking at the end of life and figuring out how it starts in the middle and all that stuff. This is by Marcel Brothers. He's a Belgian poet and painter. This is the last installation he ever made. It's a perfect model of his apartment. And there on the walls, he's had a sign painter paint words that were important in his life. As an artist, some of them are like canvas, seascape, oil, but there's also some strange ones like value, privilege, thief, because this is part of the creative life, And Brothers creates the space for others to enter imaginatively. And I think this is an exemplar. Take a moment, please, and imagine a beautiful space. Even a mundane space, even an everyday space, but a space where part of you has occupied this beautiful mind, or part of you perhaps has had an echo of childhood. Now, let a few words hover over it if you can. unbidden, what would the words be? Some might be mundane, some might be rare. If they're not quite there yet, I kind of envy you. There's something so beautiful about language that's not quite formed yet. It's still coming to the surface like an unfinished thought. Unfinished thoughts sometimes have to be finished by hand. This is the work of another artist, On Karawa. Karawa's thing, starting when he came to New York from Japan in the 60s, was to paint a painting. Most days, he painted 3,000 paintings in about 14 years. He would get up, he invented his own font, depending on what city he was working in. He worked in 112 cities all over the world. He would use a font in the language of where he was, and he would make a painting of the date. Then he put it in a specially made cardboard box, and he would put newspaper in from the same day. Then he would put a little colored dot in a 100-year calendar, charting the works. He would also send a postcard, a boring tourist postcard, to a friend or a co-worker or someone in the art world, and he'd stamp it with a date that said, "I got up," and mention what time. He was a fiercely private person. He didn't give interviews. There are very few photographs of him as an adult. All we really know, we don't even know exactly when he was born or exactly when he died. We know that he lived for 29,771 days. I imagine being in a room full of Karawa paintings, and it seems to me it would feel terribly empty or terribly rich and full in different moments between beauty and between being. And I think that's the point. I think that's what he was doing. I think about myself at 52. My wife pleasantly reminded me the other day across, she said, "You know what I read? I read that we have 28 seasons left. 28 Christmases. This is a lot worse than Mr. Patel's brunches, just to be clear. Like, that's it." And you know what my first stupid thought was? How shall I make them memorable? I was like, to who? Am I the rememberer of my life? Well, who else will be my co-rememberers? Who else will really see me? What other world can these memories live in? A world of beauty, maybe. Look at someone next to you, please, for just a moment. I promise I'll finish in a minute, but look at someone next to you. It could be a stranger. It could be a friend. This could be goofy. That's fine. Now blink, and in a blink amount of time, how will they remember you? They may forget you after today. It may be someone you don't know. How will they remember you? How are you going to live in the beauty of memory? I admire artists so much because I think they pull the beauty of intimate memory out of times that can be very, very difficult. I'm going to show you a few real quick, and then I'm going to wrap it up. This is a work by David Hammonds. It's an African-American flag. He made several, and they flew for 10 years until they were almost rags. And in 2017, a very meaningful year in the history of African-American people in the United States, and therefore a history for all people in the United States, he hung it in a museum like a sacred artwork and titled it, "Oh, Say, Can You See?" This is a work by Sable Elise Smith. It is 2 large silk screens that have been blown up and touched up with paint. They are blow-ups of a coloring book she found on the pavement of New York City. They are blow-ups of coloring books given to children whose parents are incarcerated while they are waiting to visit them in prison. Elise Smith's father was in prison for 19 years. It's a remarkable thing to imagine, finding this work and moving toward it and finding beauty in it. Finally, this is Coco Fusco, who rowed a boat in the late spring of 2020 around an island called Hart Island. And in keeping with an Afro-Caribbean, Latin American tradition, she recited a poem and threw flowers over the edge of the boat. For all of the dead buried on the island is Hart Island. They have buried 1 million people there estimated, because most of them were undocumented, in the last 100 years. Prisoners, homeless people, people whose bodies might not be claimed in the first 48 hours of their death, which is New York City's policy, which meant a lot of people who died from COVID, about 2,000 New Yorkers who died of COVID in 2020. I want to wrap up. I want to be choked up. But I'll finish with, oh my goodness, sorry, Rory. I'm going to finish up with just a quick comment, and that is, I'll even hold still. Let's all hold still. Beauty pulls moments out of historical consequence in our own lives, in larger worlds. It pulls truth out of moments of consequence. And in those moments, in those beauties that feel very temporary, but could stretch in our minds into something much, much longer, there is a serenity that serenely disdains to destroy us. But more to the point, and why I care that you listen, and thank you so much, that we might find in ourselves a serenity that stops us from destroying ourselves. Thank you.